The announcement appeared in a Dallas business publication on a Tuesday morning in September. I was having coffee. My phone was on the counter. The notification appeared because I still had a Google alert set for the company name, a habit I had not thought to cancel after the divorce, because I had not thought much about the company at all after the divorce, because I had been told, repeatedly, and with supporting documentation, that the company was not worth thinking about. I tapped the notification. The headline said, Meridian Supply Partners acquired by National Logistics Group in $2.3 million transaction. Meridian Supply Partners. The company my ex-husband and I had built together over 9 years. The company he had described, in 4 separate conversations during our divorce proceedings, as a liability rather than an asset. The company his financial expert had valued at negative equity in the formal disclosure documents. The company I had been advised, by my own attorney, based on the information available, to leave behind in favor of the house. $2.3 million. I set down my coffee. I opened my laptop, not to call anyone, not yet, to find out when the sale had been agreed. The transaction announcement mentioned a purchase agreement signed in July, 2 months after our divorce had been finalized in May. 2 months. I searched further. Deal announcements of this size typically reference a process: investment bankers, letters of intent, preliminary agreements. The kind of timeline that does not begin 2 months before a closing. I found a reference in the acquirer's press release. It said, following a 6-month engagement process beginning in December of last year. December. Our divorce proceedings had begun in November. The financial disclosures, the ones that had shown the company at negative equity, had been filed in February. December to February. The engagement process had been underway while the disclosures were being prepared. I called my attorney. My name is Carol Bennett. I am 44 years old. I was married to Richard Bennett for 14 years. We had met in our late 20s at a supply chain conference in Houston, both of us working for other companies, both of us with ambitions that exceeded our current positions, both of us interested in the same problem from different angles. His angle was relationships. He understood how to build and sustain the vendor and client connections that a logistics business ran on. My angle was operations. I understood how to build the systems that made those relationships scalable, the contracts, the processes, the infrastructure that turned a set of relationships into a repeatable business. We started Meridian Supply Partners in our living room in 2010. 11 years of building. By the year of our divorce, the company had 14 employees, 31 active clients, and a revenue base that I knew, from the inside, from the years I had built it, was not the liability the financial disclosure had described. The divorce was not dramatic. We had grown apart in the way that people grow apart when they spend a decade building something together and then run out of shared language for anything that is not the business. No infidelity, no crisis. Just 2 people who had become business partners who also happened to be married and who had realized, slowly and then all at once, that the business was the only thing holding the marriage together. I had initiated the divorce. That matters because it means I had gone into the proceedings willing to be fair and willing to accept less than I might have pushed for if I had been angry. I had not wanted a fight. I had wanted an end. Richard had known that. He had used it. Divorce financial disclosures in Texas require both parties to provide a complete accounting of all marital assets and their values. Richard had provided his disclosures in February. I had provided mine. Our respective attorneys had reviewed the numbers, and our shared financial expert, a forensic accountant named Gerald, who had been agreed upon by both sides as a neutral party, had assessed the business. Gerald's assessment: Meridian Supply Partners carried significant vendor credit obligations, 2 pending contract disputes with clients, and a cash flow profile that showed the business operating at minimal margin. His formal valuation placed the company at a range of negative $200,000 to positive $50,000, depending on resolution of the pending disputes. I had read Gerald's report carefully. I am an operations person. I had built this company. The report had described a version of the company that I recognized in its individual facts and did not recognize in its overall portrait. I had raised this with my attorney. She had said, "Carol, you can commission a second valuation, but that will cost time and money, and Gerald is a respected neutral. His report will carry weight." I had not commissioned a second valuation. I had looked at the house, a 4-bedroom in University Park that I loved, and that Richard had seemed willing to let me have without significant negotiation, and I had made the calculation that a neutral expert had assessed the business as worth nothing, and that the house was worth approximately $890,000, and that I was tired and I wanted it to be over. I had signed in May. Richard had signed in May. In December of the previous year, while our proceedings were beginning, while Gerald was preparing his assessment, while I was deciding whether to commission a competing valuation, Richard had engaged an investment bank to begin the formal sale process for Meridian Supply Partners. I found this out in September. 5 months after I had signed. My attorney's name is Sarah. She had handled the divorce, and she handled the September phone call with the specific composure of someone who has heard many things and has learned not to react before she has the full picture. I said, "The company sold for $2.3 million in September. The acquirer's press release says the engagement process began in December. Our disclosures were filed in February. Gerald's valuation placed the company at negative equity." Sarah said, "Carol, I need you to hold on this while I make some calls." She called me back the next morning. Sarah said, "I have spoken to a litigation colleague who specializes in divorce fraud. What you are describing, if the timeline holds, is a material misrepresentation of marital assets during divorce proceedings. It is a serious allegation, and it requires documentation to pursue." I said, "What kind of documentation?" She said, "Evidence that Richard was engaged in a sale process at the time of the disclosures. The press release reference to a 6-month engagement beginning in December is suggestive, but not conclusive. We need the actual letter of intent or engagement agreement if one exists." I said, "How do I find that?" She said, "You hire someone to look." The investigator's name was Patricia. She had spent 15 years in financial forensics before starting her own firm. Sarah had used her twice before in asset concealment cases. Patricia said, "Mrs. Bennett, if a letter of intent was executed in December, it will have been filed somewhere. Investment bank engagement letters are referenced in deal documentation. The acquirer's due diligence files will reference the timeline. I can find it if it exists." She found it in 11 days. A letter of intent between Meridian Supply Partners and National Logistics Group, dated December 14th. 2 months before Gerald filed his valuation. 3 months before I signed the divorce agreement. Richard had been negotiating the sale of our company for 3 months while his financial expert was describing it as a liability. If you have ever trusted a process that was being managed by someone who had already decided the outcome, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. New story every day. Sarah filed the motion to reopen the divorce settlement in October. The legal basis? Fraud on the court. Richard had provided materially false financial disclosures by failing to disclose an active letter of intent for the sale of a marital asset. The concealment had directly influenced the asset division I had agreed to. Richard retained new counsel, a firm I did not recognize with a reputation for aggressive defense in high-stakes civil matters. His attorney's initial response: "The letter of intent was non-binding and therefore did not constitute a realized asset at the time of disclosure. The obligation to disclose existed for completed transactions, not preliminary expressions of interest." Sarah's response: "A letter of intent executed with an investment bank 3 months before a formal disclosure is not a preliminary expression of interest. It is an active transaction process. The failure to disclose it, combined with a forensic valuation that described the business as having negative equity during a period when the owner was actively pursuing a multi-million-dollar sale, constitutes a deliberate misrepresentation of the asset's value and prospects." The judge agreed to hear the motion. The hearing was in January. 8 months after I had signed the divorce agreement, 4 months after I had found the sale announcement over morning coffee. Richard's attorney presented 2 arguments. The first, that the LOI was non-binding and that many deals fall through at the LOI stage, making the asset's value genuinely uncertain at the time of disclosure. The second, that Gerald's valuation had been based on the company's condition at the time of assessment, and that the subsequent sale price reflected changes in the market and in the company's performance that had developed after the divorce. Sarah addressed both. On the first, a non-binding LOI does not eliminate the obligation to disclose an active sale process. The existence of the process itself is material information that affects how a reasonable party would assess the asset's value. Richard had not disclosed the process. I had therefore made my settlement decision without information I was legally entitled to have. On the second, the company's performance data showed no material change between the disclosure period and the sale. The revenue, the client roster, and the vendor relationships were substantially identical. The sale price reflected the company's actual value, a value that had been present during the disclosure period and that Gerald's assessment had not reflected. Gerald was called as a witness. He testified that he had not been informed of the letter of intent during his assessment process. He had not been informed. Richard had engaged an investment bank in December and had provided financial information to that bank for the purpose of supporting a sale process. He had then retained a neutral forensic accountant to assess the business for divorce purposes and had not disclosed the active sale process to that accountant. 2 separate processes, 2 separate pictures of the same company, one showing it at negative equity, one supporting a $2.3 million sale price. The judge found fraud on the court. The remedy took 3 months to finalize. The legal standard in Texas for fraud on the court in a divorce proceeding allows for reopening of the settlement and redistribution of assets to account for the concealment. The redistributed asset was the sale proceeds from Meridian Supply Partners. The $2.3 million sale price had already been received by Richard. The court ordered a redistribution of that amount to reflect what my share would have been had the asset been properly disclosed and valued during the original proceedings. My attorney and Richard's attorney negotiated the share percentage. The original settlement had given me the house and Richard the company. The house was worth $890,000. The company, as disclosed, had been valued at negative equity. The settlement had therefore been structured with the house as my primary asset. Had the company been properly disclosed at its actual value, which the $2.3 million sale price confirmed, a fair division would have given me a significantly larger share of the total marital estate. The negotiated remedy, $940,000. Not half of the sale price, a calculated amount representing the difference between what I had received and what a fair division would have produced given the company's actual value, $940,000. Transferred to my account on a Thursday afternoon in April, 14 months after I had signed the divorce agreement over a company I had been told was worthless. Richard did not contest the final transfer. His attorney had advised him, I was told, that contesting further risked criminal referral for the fraud finding. He transferred the amount, and the matter was closed. I sat in the house in University Park that afternoon. The house I had chosen over the company because I had trusted the process. The house that was worth $890,000 on the day I signed, and that was still worth $890,000, and that I still loved, and that had been the right thing to want, even when the information I had been given had been wrong. I had the house. Now, I also had $940,000. I am 44 years old, and my ex-husband concealed an active $2.3 million sale process from our divorce proceedings, while a neutral financial expert described the company as having negative equity. The first thing, financial disclosures in divorce proceedings are only as accurate as what is disclosed. I had trusted the process. I had trusted the neutral expert. I had trusted that the legal obligation to disclose marital assets completely and accurately was sufficient to ensure complete and accurate disclosure. It was not. The obligation exists. The penalty for violating it, fraud on the court, is serious. Neither of these facts prevented Richard from making the calculation that concealment was worth the risk. If you are going through a divorce and there is a business involved, commission your own valuation. Do not rely solely on a neutral expert your spouse had any involvement in selecting or briefing. A neutral expert who is not informed of an active sale process will not assess the asset as if a sale process is underway. That is not the expert's failure. It is the failure of the person who had the obligation to disclose and did not. Your own valuation professional, engaged by you, briefed by you, looking specifically for evidence of active transactions. That is the protection. It costs money. It costs time. It costs far less than the difference between $890,000 and $890,000 plus $940,000. The second thing is about the choice I made. I took the house because I was tired and I wanted it to be over, and I had been told by a neutral expert that the company was worth nothing. All of those things were true. The first two remain true. I was tired. I wanted it to be over. And the third was a lie constructed by a man who understood my exhaustion and used it. I do not carry guilt about being tired. What I carry is the specific knowledge that my exhaustion was legible to someone who had 14 years of knowing exactly what my exhaustion looked like and who made a calculation about what it would let him get away with. Know what you own, even when you are tired, even when you want it to be over. The moment of greatest exhaustion is frequently the moment when the most consequential decision is placed in front of you. The third thing is about Gerald and what his report actually was. Gerald was a competent forensic accountant who produced an accurate assessment of the information he was given. He was not given the letter of intent. He was not told about the investment bank engagement. He assessed a company as presented to him and produced a valuation consistent with what was presented. He was used as a tool by someone who understood how the tool worked and what information to withhold to produce the desired output. This is how sophisticated concealment operates. Not by corrupting the expert, by controlling what the expert sees. Gerald saw a company with vendor obligations and pending disputes and minimal cash flow margin. He did not see a company that had been in active sale discussions for 2 months with a buyer who would pay $2.3 million. Both of those were the same company on the same day. Richard chose. Which one Gerald saw? Be aware of what information you are providing to shared experts and what information your spouse is providing. The neutral expert's neutrality depends on both parties providing complete information. It is not a guarantee of completeness. Patricia found the letter of intent in 11 days. I should have hired her 6 months earlier. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, have you ever made a decision based on information that turned out to have been managed specifically to produce that decision? And which moment stayed with you longer? Reading the $2.3 million announcement over morning coffee, or hearing the judge say fraud on the court? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. New story every day. Carol Bennett, Dallas, Texas.